This is a picture of Nagasaki, Japan today, and this is a picture of Chicago, Illinois in the US. These two images illustrate how policy can either create prosperity or tragedy. For context, you may remember from history that Nagasaki as well as Hiroshima were two cities struck with the devastating impact of a nuclear bomb, which effectively ended World War II in 1946. The nuclear impact should have left this land uninhabitable, but the effects of radiation were dramatically mitigated due to a variety of circumstances, allowing locals, supported by efforts from surrounding areas, some help from foreign military, and eventually the Japanese government, to restore civilization to the landscape in a remarkably short amount of time. Power was restored to surviving buildings along with running water just days after the bomb. Steps to revitalize the area, remove contaminated topsoil, and restore the natural ecosystem were top priorities, and by 1958, just 12 years later, the city's population was restored to its pre-war levels of 140,000. Factories and land that had been owned by the military and government were turned over to the locals who restored the local economy. In turn, they were able to restore the land to habitable standards and create a sprawling city that is clean, wealthy, and safe to live in. And this isn't the only such city. In fact, all across Japan, there are beautiful cities which are clean and safe to live in. Now contrast this story with Chicago, which has become a meme for poverty, drugs, gangs, and violence in the US. And it isn't the only one. It's not even the worst. In fact, all 25 of the worst cities in the US have the same tragic story. Highest poverty, highest crime, highest homelessness, highest unemployment, highest dropout rates, lowest literacy, lowest graduation rates, and lowest academic scores despite receiving more federal funding than any other school systems. These cities and many others all across the US routinely score high above the national average in all of the worst possible ways. The common theme among them is that every one of these cities has been run by policies of the Democratic Party for decades. The top 10 states with the most debt are also a reflection of how much Democrat policies have influence, as dictated by population. The more Democratic voters you have, the more poverty there is. These 10 states are mostly Democratic strongholds, with California 2 or 3 times higher in debt than nearly every other state in the top 10. And while states like Texas have been strongly Republican-led, this state also has 2 high-population cities with strong progressive Democrat policy leaders, which have primarily been the cause of so much debt accumulation, along with the state's continuous battle against an unsecured border with Mexico and the drug cartels supported by China, which cost the state billions of tax dollars every year, and ignored by the federal government in violation of the United States Constitution, which mandates a secure border. Which is all to say, even though Texas is high on this list, and although it is a red state, it is the policies of the blue sections of that state that have created the debt problem it has. Overspending is a common policy of the Democratic Party, yet their spending always shows a worsening of social economic problems. USA Today posted a list of the 25 most dangerous cities in America, and after checking that list, I confirmed every one of them are and have historically been democratically run. They each score much higher on the national poverty rate of 12%, the highest at 38% poverty. I then found a list of the 25 safest cities in America, according to Patch.com, referencing data for each city by bestplaces.net. Their data shows that about half the cities are Republican-led, but also that the other cities distinguish themselves from their violent Democratic counterparts by being heavily influenced by Republican representation and a history of moderate or middle ground bipartisanship, with very few outliers. This was not the case for the violent and poverty-ridden cities, who have been leaders of progressive ideology and partisan for the Democratic Party for decades. Pew Research Centers show that liberal communities have higher taxes and much higher expenditures per capita than conservative cities. The question becomes, how is it that of all the places in America, how do those that spend the most end up creating the most poverty and crime, and the more they spend, the worse it gets?
Now, it's a very funny thing that the same forces that want to cut our defense spending are the same ones that want to increase all these social services and this social tinkering and experimenting that hasn't worked. And every time it doesn't work, they just impose a more expensive program on top of it.
Interesting note, according to studies, conservatives give far more in charity and service than other groups, and are more happy as a rule, while those on the left receive the most charity and are more unhappy than others, even among comparable populations with similar incomes and lifestyles. As an independent study, we took a graph outlining the GDP growth of the US by year, beginning with the start of the 20th century. Then we plotted each presidential administration and their years in office against the graph, and separated them by party. What we clearly see is that in almost every case, years where a Democratic president was in office, GDP growth stagnated, and in some cases even recessed, meaning when the Democrats are leading the country, there tends to be economic depressions or stagnations of growth. But it gets worse than this. The Democratic Party of the United States runs on its ability to provide and solve problems. So they are incentivized to create problems, inequality, poverty, and need for their policies, whatever it takes. This is why Democrats are always advocating to increase the size and power of the government, to take and spend more of your money, and create systems to keep people poor, uneducated, and dependent on their system of welfare. This creation of problems, this manufacture of issues, isn't anything new. It's, in fact, so common, it's a meme. Even cartoonists make jokes about it.
You're not bound by morality. Help us go back to the old days where we pretend to fix the problems we cause.
The pattern is predictable. Find a problem. Institute a short-sighted action to appease rather than fix. Create oversight. Use enforcement to create new problems. Blame others. Institute new actions to manage the problems. Expand oversight. Enforce. Cause new problems. Blame others. Institute new actions. Expand more. Enforce, causing new problems. On and on it goes.
Mr. President, in talking about the continuing recession tonight, you have blamed mistakes of the past, and you have blamed the Congress. Does any of the blame belong to you?
Yes, because for many years I was a Democrat.
Our government has expanded exponentially since the 1940s, in every case, mostly under the direction of Democratic leadership. According to the Foundation for Economic Education, recognizing the propensity of government to grow, the people added the Bill of Rights to the Constitution as an additional layer of protection for the rights of individuals against the state. The Bill of Rights was to ensure that government would never grow so large that it could trample on the individual and economic liberties of American citizens. These liberties are eroding. The United States has been gradually transformed from a nation with almost no government presence in the marketplace to one in which the government is now the predominant actor in the domestic economy. Consider the following. There are now more Americans employed by government than by the entire manufacturing sector in America. In the past 25 years, the federal government has spent $2.5 trillion on welfare and aid to cities. This is enough money to purchase all of the assets of the Fortune 500 companies, plus all of the farmland in the United States. In 1987, U.S. farmers received more money in government subsidies than they did in selling their crops to the marketplace. In short, farmers now produce for the government, not for U.S. consumers, not for you and me. In 3 states today, California, Maine, and New York, almost half of all middle-income family wages are captured by government through income, payroll, property, and sales tax, and other levies. This expansion and encroachment on the civil liberties of Americans has always been promulgated by the Democratic establishment. Government involvement in the domestic economy was supposed to be funded and delivered at the state and local levels. As pointed out by the FFEE, even that involvement was to be restricted. The founders of America did not create a Department of Commerce, a Department of Education, or a Department of Housing and Urban Development, or a Department of Health and Human Services. And this was not an oversight. They simply never imagined that the national government would take an active role in such activities. But now let's look at the Democrats who are currently running these expensive, bloated, ineffective, and unnecessary departments of our government. The Department of Commerce is currently run by Gina Raimondo, with what seems to be an impressive academic record. However, Raimondo has been criticized heavily by peers and gained opponents in her own party. Other Democrats say she should never have been given a cabinet position. Why? Well, Raimondo was previously the governor of Rhode Island and involved with several scandals and management mishaps, according to news outlets such as the New York Times, USA Today, the Providence Journal, CNBC, and others. They say, Quote, Raimondo's office appears taken by surprise this week when House Speaker Nicholas Mettiello cited what he called systemic management problems in the 4 agencies that make up the State Executive Office of Health and Human Services. From Go Local Prov, Raimondo's absenteeism and gross negligence has caused enormous harm to Rhode Islanders and cost the state millions. Raimondo's administration misled lawmakers about indicted call center leader Richard Noceto. Every month it's more scandal and mismanagement. Raimondo, who prided herself on her economic record, will leave the state in much the same way she found it, in economic tatters. As stated by former Rhode Island Director of Administration Gary Sass, the structural problem that she inherited remains as she decamps to Washington. 40% of new jobs were created in low-wage industries. Public schools continue to fail too many students. A game-changer approach to innovation is not apparent. From CNBC, Rhode Island is bottom state for business in CNBC's 13th annual America's Top States for Business Competitiveness ranking. CNBC continues, quote, Rhode Island still has America's worst infrastructure. Half of the state's roads are in less than acceptable condition, according to U.S. Department of Transportation data. That is by far the worst in the country. More than 23% of the state's bridges are in poor condition, also the worst figure in the nation. CNBC goes on to state, the state finishes near the bottom of the economy category at number 48. The state's gross domestic product grew by a paltry 0.6% in 2018, the third lowest in the nation. But there you have it. And despite such pushback from Raimondo's own party, she is now the person in charge of managing the country's financial prosperity. What about the Department of Education, currently run by Miguel Cardona? Well, he's educated, he served as a teacher and a principal, and as reported by many news outlets, was directly involved with a letter to the DoD in which concerned parents of school-aged children who have done nothing wrong, no crimes were committed. These parents are called domestic terrorists. And as such, Secretary Cardona, being directly linked to this letter, seems to feel that the Patriot Act should be implemented against parents of children he has been graciously given the privilege of educating. For the record, the Patriot Act, in simple terms, is a way for law enforcement to violate the Constitution and your civil liberties with impunity. But besides all that, this report ignores the details of what these parents were concerned about in the first place. They were concerned with bad education practices and policies that violate parent-guardian rights, something any parent would be concerned with. And there is additional reason for concern. The Department of Education has a near $70 billion budget. What do they spend it on? According to Learn.org, the key mission of the department has 3 components. 1. Provide financial aid. 2. Collect data on schools. And 3. Identify school issues. It doesn't require a degree to identify that it doesn't take tens of billions of your money to meet these 3 simple expectations. So what do they do with all that extra money? Who's profiting? Apparently, at least in part, the Chinese Communist Party. A letter from 2 state reps to the Department of Education directs serious questions to Secretary Cardona about how funding is being allocated and why large gifts from foreign governments like the CCP are not being reported in violation of Section 117 of the Higher Education Act. They point out that just a few years ago, the Trump administration identified more than $6.5 billion in unreported foreign gifts to American education institutions and opened 19 separate investigations into various universities over their foreign ties. And yet, the Department of Education, with all its resources, funding, and manning, seems to be silent on this matter. So much for the third mission goal, identify education issues. Because this is a big one, it's a big oversight. The only rational conclusion as to why they aren't doing anything about this, or even responding to this letter from state representatives, is that they don't care, or are thus content with the corruption and overspending at you, the taxpayers' expense. Let's move on to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, run by Marcia Fudge. From the National Urban League, Secretary Fudge is committed to making the dream of homeownership and the security and wealth creation that comes with it a reality for more Americans. Under Secretary Fudge's leadership, the Department of Housing and Urban Development will work to eradicate the growing homelessness issue put an end to the discriminatory practices in the housing market, and ensure that our fair housing rules are doing what they are supposed to do, opening the door for families who have been systemically locked out for generations to buy homes and have a fair shot at achieving the American dream. Which is all well and good, but any guess at how that's going? According to CNBC, buying a home is a hard thing right now. Many reasons are given. In fact, it was just released that Americans are currently facing the highest mortgage rates we've seen since 2007, just before the market crash of 2008. Homelessness is also not gotten any better. In most cities, it's actually getting much worse. And dealing with the massive inflation our nation is currently facing, the Fed is raising interest rates, making it even less likely that Americans will be able to buy a home. And how about that fair shot for those locked out of housing? I was able to find this petition sent to the department for a 73-year-old blind woman who was kicked out of her Section 8 housing because she wasn't able to fill out the annual renewal form. Why? Because, well, she's blind. Letters sent to the department on her behalf have been rejected. This all seems to violate the Americans with Disabilities Act signed into law by President Bush, a Republican, to guarantee that such people be treated fairly. But that doesn't seem to be what the department is currently all about. So what is Secretary Fudge doing about all this? A better question is, what can she do about it? Probably not much. Housing issues are and always will be a local problem. It involves supply and demand, fiscal policies which affect the market, and the Fed's interest rates, all things that the Department of Housing has no control of. It's a very cushy, do-nothing job, which is why if you try to find articles about what Secretary Fudge has been up to since she's been in office, you won't find anything. And moving on to the Department of Health and Human Services, run by Xavier Becerra. Secretary Becerra is not a doctor. He is not a medical professional of any kind. He's a lawyer. He has worked mostly in the failed state of California. I say failed state because most of its cities have been called worse than third world countries, and that's coming from people who are from third world countries. It has been widely reported that Becerra, as Attorney General, was repeatedly accused of writing his bias into ballot titles and summaries in violation of the law, which requires the descriptions to be clear and accurate representation of what the bills are for. According to Becerra's own record, he supports the right of a woman to seek an abortion on the merit of its gender. In other words, if you find out you are having a girl, but you wanted a boy, Becerra thinks this is reason enough to kill the pregnancy, and that's just like they've done in communist China for decades. He also thinks it's okay for a woman to take methamphetamines to have a stillborn pregnancy. I guess he thinks poisoning yourself to terminate a pregnancy is a safe and reasonable thing to do. Becerra also engaged in more than 60 frivolous lawsuits in abuse of the justice system in order to hamstring the border wall, the same border wall that now President Biden is currently working on. I have not been able to find any lawsuits or complaints from Becerra regarding the current construction of the border wall, for some reason. Becerra's nomination to the Office of Health and Human Services was heavily contested even by other Democrats. He was confirmed with a vote of 50 to 49, the narrowest margin of any of Biden's appointees. Critics cite his lack of healthcare experience, as well as his blatant disrespect for the constitutional rights of religious freedom. But that's not all. Reported by Yahoo News, Becerra engaged in politically motivated attacks on campaign opponents, destroying the lives and livelihoods of low-level campaign managers. He did so by lying about the methods of ballot collection being used, a method his own Democratic Party pioneered 2 years before. The managers did nothing wrong and have been vindicated, but their lives remain in tatters because of this man. And this concludes our discussion on what Democrats are running the most useless departments of our federal government. And to be clear, we aren't singling out these departments and these secretaries just to call anyone out. These represent clear examples, a trend within the Democratic establishment. Learning about this paints a picture of what the Democrats are all about. It shows us how they think, how they're motivated, and how they operate. It shows us a cross-section of the culture they produce. And I'd like to say it's a culture that's pretty self-evident, but we aren't quite there yet. We also can't ignore the history of the Democratic Party and what they've done to America, for which they should be summarily condemned every day. Remember, of course, that it was the Democratic Party which perpetuated slavery and instigated the Civil War, which killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Remember, it is the party of the Democrats who founded and perpetuated the KKK. Remember, it is the Democrats who created Jim Crow laws and forced segregation. Remember the Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre of 1921? It destroyed businesses and killed the residents of a black community. Oklahoma was dominated by the Democratic Party at the time, and additionally, they made laws to prevent African Americans from holding elected office in the state. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King was violence perpetuated by Democrats. This includes the harassment of King by the FBI, who was run by Democratic leaders. The same FBI with a history of scandals under Democratic supervision in every case, such as community poisonings during the era of Prohibition, illegal spying, manipulation, and disinformation against political opponents from the 1930s to the Watergate scandal to the Russiagate scandal of today. The same FBI who also engaged in political entrapment, a partisan Democrat agenda, while actively ignoring criminal investigations such as Hunter Biden, Jeffrey Epstein, Operation Crossfire Hurricane, the abuse of young girls at the Olympics, and many, many more. Members of the Democratic Party most recently engaged in a political coup to seditiously overthrow our democratic process by paying for the manufacture of scandals they invented to unseat a duly elected president, and they tried it twice. The FBI was instrumental in perpetuating the false narrative they helped create, a seditious act against the nation they are sworn to serve. And as their attempts to overthrow our government failed, other more violent actions took their place. You've probably heard about January 6th, but what you haven't heard about is May 29th. Democrat citizens engaged in domestic terror against the White House. They burned down guard posts surrounding structures, including a church known as the President's Church. They injured 90 Secret Service members and an estimated 150 officers. Way, way worse than January 6th. And the corporate media, run by the Democrats, has remained silent on the matter because they don't want you to know about it. The same corporate media, dominated by Democrats, that has spent the last 7 years lying to each of us about almost every major news story of the last 7 years.
Like, what is it that is stopping the masses from understanding these sort of deeper rules behind what's shaping all of these wars across the world?
Not even the wars. I mean, I don't really know, because I ask myself this every day with COVID stuff. I mean, how many times does the news have to contradict itself? How many stories have to come out that are fake until you finally say, hey, maybe something's not right here? As it pertains to Donald Trump, I didn't vote for him in 2016, but what did we get under Trump? ISIS was crushed, so the region is stabilizing. The Abraham Accords, peace in the Middle East starting to form, and he was the bad guy. And the economy was doing really, really well. Now, a year on, it scares me that there are so many people in this country that can see the media lie about, let's just say, Kyle Rittenhouse, that was a lie. George Floyd was grossly misinterpreted. The footage comes out, the whole story is different. The Covington kids, they smear, that was a lie. Russiagate, Trump colluded with Russia. Years of lying. Ukrainegate, Trump, they say that Trump was trying to leverage Ukraine to go after his political rival Joe Biden when Joe Biden wasn't even running for president. And now, if you look at all the data, especially the reporting from Matt Taibbi, it just looks like Joe Biden actually was corrupt. And what I think Donald Trump stumbled upon this corruption story on accident. And he was just like, hey, take a look into this. So they lie about it.
And they went insane. And then they wanted him to be impeached. It was like, don't even look at Ukraine. Don't even talk about Ukraine. We're going to impeach you for a phone call. And people aren't piecing the stories together. Like, what are the chances that where your president, has interests, Burisma, Igor Kolomoisky, I've been talking about this, like, guys, Igor Kolomoisky, he funded the president, Zelensky, into power. He funded his show. He's also, the controlling interest of Burisma. This is more complicated, but people are not looking there, right?
The media, it's fascinating to me that the news will come out, report something, like I was mentioning with TechCrunch, then come out a week later, oh no, that was fake news. They'll come to you and say, you're spreading disinformation, and it's their own reporting.
Right.
But imagine if lying was your job. Imagine forcing yourself to tell lies all day about everything in ways that were so transparent and so outlandish that there is no way the people listening to you could possibly believe anything you said. Then imagine doing that again and again and again every day of your professional life for your entire life.
They don't want you to know how violent the Democratic establishment is. An Antifa member shot and killed a random person in Portland just because he was wearing a hat the man didn't like. Recently, a Democrat in New York ran down an 18-year-old boy in his car. He murdered a young innocent boy because the man believed this boy was a conservative. And because he's a conservative, he must be an extremist. And we can kind of understand where he might get this understanding from, since it was just recently that President Joe Biden, in an address to the nation, called conservatives extremists, and the most dangerous thing to our democracy. The man was surprised when officials took him into custody. But again, these kinds of acts are not surprising when we see Democratic officials calling for violence and releasing criminals, including murderers, onto the streets.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country. Maybe there will be.
You know, there needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
Enemies of the state.
I'd like to punch him in the face.
I said if we were in high school, I'd take him behind the gym and beat the hell out of him.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
We have to stop demonizing people and realize the biggest terror threat in this country is white men, most of them radicalized to the right.
I would say our country should be more fearful of white men across our country.
Punch some people in the face!
And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome.
Shouldn't that be done by a commission or the city council, not a mob in the middle of the night throwing it into the harbor?
People will do what they do.
I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
That's it right there. For a 3-year-old child.
And I will never stop saying, not only do we need to disinvest in police, but we need to completely dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department.
A Minnesota bail fund supported by Vice President Kamala Harris during her 2020 campaign helped set an accused domestic abuser free. Now, just weeks after his release, he's back behind bars after prosecutors charged him with murder.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 has been criticized in hindsight even by civil rights leaders for causing the impoverishment of millions of minorities, disrupting families, creating dependence on government services, leading to gang violence, and normalizing single-parent homes. This act was created and signed into law by Democrats. And also, the move to a Federal Reserve currency, which analysts show have caused greater and longer-lasting economic recessions, was implemented in the dead of night on a weekend so as not to be noticed by the general public by Democrats.
The Federal Reserve is the #1 reason why we have income inequality right now. And now they are also creating a lack of an opportunity gap, right, between those who have and have not. That gap is growing. In the first year of COVID, of 2020, our nation increased the number of millionaires by 30%. And I'm talking to people who were getting pay cuts, like 35% pay cuts, right? And I'm listening to the media talking about we're all in this together. And yet our nation, at one of the most, destructive times in our economy and lives, we were growing the number of millionaires by 30%. If you went into COVID with a significant amount of assets, it was the best thing that ever happened to you. As the Federal Reserve specifically began to shift wealth from the people to certain entities, right? They are the #1 reason for this wealth gap that we have. And now we're looking to the Federal Reserve to fix what the Federal Reserve broke in the first place.
The globalist policies which have gutted our nation's manufacturing industry, destroyed Midwestern cities, and taken millions of jobs out of America, and forced our nation into dependence on foreign dictators who, by the way, hate us, while at the same time enrich and empower ruthless transnational criminal organizations such as the Chinese Communist Party, the Mexican cartels, and Saudi Arabia, have been planned, organized, directed, implemented, and supported by, well, you guessed it, the Democratic Party of America. In the last 200 years, the U.S. has been engaged in its share of conflict, a civil war followed by 2 world wars and many military engagements otherwise. Would it surprise you at this point to know that almost every single war and conflict of the past 200 years was overseen by Democratic administrations? Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate State of America, started the Civil War on April 12th of 1861. Of course, he was a Democrat. World War I, Woodrow Wilson, Democrat. World War II, FDR, Democrat. It was also Truman, a Democrat, who was the first and only one to use nuclear weapons on people, which occurred in the same conflict. The Korean War was also overseen by Harry Truman, a Democrat. And the Vietnam War was engaged with militarily by 3 U.S. presidents: John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon, all Democrats. Only 2 wars were entered into by Republican administrations, the Gulf War and the Afghanistan conflict. They happened under the 2 Bush presidents. But the Afghanistan conflict was also largely overseen by Obama, a Democrat who perpetuated military intervention in dozens of nations beyond the scope of the Afghanistan conflict during his 2 terms in office. Which brings us to today, where some argue we are engaged in a proxy war with Russia over the Ukraine conflict, which could escalate to open war between the U.S. and Russia any time, or could see us involved in war with China within a few years under the current administration, Joe Biden, who of course is a Democrat. And by the way, it was just stated publicly by 3 Democratic representatives that the most important thing for our national security today is to defeat Russia, which is a very interesting statement to make, being that we are technically not at war with Russia. In fact, that it is Congress that's supposed to be the one to declare war, and they have done no such thing, but yet these representatives of the Democratic Party seem to think that it is our responsibility to defeat Russia. Why us? Did we vote on this? So you see, it may very well be that we are actually currently at war with Russia after all. But of course, they're going to obfuscate that. They're not going to state that out loud, not in the open, at least not yet. I guess maybe some think playing chicken with nuclear weapons is fun somehow.
I can no longer remain in today's Democratic Party that's under the complete control of an elitist cabal of warmongers who are driven by cowardly wokeness, who divide us by racializing every issue and stoking anti-white racism, who actively work to undermine our God-given freedoms that are enshrined in our Constitution, who are hostile to people of faith and spirituality, who demonize the police but protect criminals at the expense of law-abiding Americans, who believe in open borders, who weaponize the national security state to go after their political opponents, and above all, who are dragging us ever closer to nuclear war. Now, I believe in a government that's of the people, by the people, and for the people. Unfortunately, today's Democratic Party does not. Instead, it stands for a government that is of, by, and for the powerful elite.
Today, while Democrats argue over who can use what bathrooms and what persons can compete in what sports, they literally don't know how many genders there are and think getting rid of law enforcement is practical, while also trying to create a federal police force, while protecting a corrupt and partisan FBI, while they fight to eliminate equality for all in favor of inherently prejudiced ideology, and secretly engage in acts to instigate segregationist indoctrination into our schools and institutions. While all this is going on, the schools they dominate are full of students who can't read, fail at basic math, and have a skewed idea of American history. These are students who are not safe at home or on the streets of Democrat-dominated cities. And the most damning part of it all is that they think their priorities are correct. In Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, lays out 6 moral foundations of politics. They include care, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty. Haidt points out that those on the political left are concerned primarily with only 2 of those 6, care and fairness, while those on the political right consider all 6 foundations equally, With this understanding, according to several commentators on this subject, the left become predictable in their political views and often fail to comprehend the right. This theory may offer some explanation for why policymakers on the left tend to enact policies that are short-sighted and unbalanced, ultimately resulting in more harm than good. Of course, there is far more to cover here than we are able to in one episode. The refuse of the Democrats runs deep and long. It will never be enough to account for it all. What we have covered will have to do for the time being. What we have learned is that the Democratic Party of the United States is corrupt, violent, hateful, prejudiced, full of liars, and full of self-interest, not the interests of the American people, especially not the interests of communities they claim to represent the most. It always has been this way. Nothing's changed. But we are currently in the middle of a voting season for the midterm elections of 2022. Most people vote without knowing who they are voting for and vote with groupthink instead of what's best for the community. But you now know better. You have learned what this party is, and you are accountable to that knowledge. I won't say you should vote for one party or another. I would encourage you to consider a third party if you are so inclined. Our founders never intended for two parties to rule as they have. And so a third party might be good for America. Maybe. You'll have to decide for yourself. Only one thing is clear. The Democratic Party must be done. Forever. Never let it come into your cities again. Never vote Democrat.